Well, after the rain comes the sun. Here we are on Fő utca in Budapest. And here is my good friend, the man, the myth, the legend, Taras Shevchenko. Why do they have a statue for a Ukrainian poet in Budapest? Seems kind of random, doesn't it? Well, as it turns out, Mr. Shevchenko was a hero, a legend, a revolutionary, and a man who inspired so much and who continues to inspire to this very day. Whoa, whoa, oh, how you doing?
How am I doing? The question is, how are you doing? I was born in 1814 into a family of serfs.
And his parents, they were poor peasant people living on the lands of their Russian landlords, the Engelgarts. And soon enough, as many serfs did in those days, Taras Shevchenko, his mother died. She had a hard life in the fields, working to support her family. And as Taras would later write in his poetry, she died in hardship and misery. His father remarried, but the woman that he remarried to, she was quite cruel. She brought 3 children along with her and treated Taras as nothing more than a nuisance. And when his father died in 1825, the stepmother, she fled for the hills, she ran away, and Taras was left as an orphan. But one thing that separated the young Taras from other young, poor Ukrainian boys of his age was his skill as a painter. And that oil painting back there that we saw in the window is actually quite similar to the style in which young Taras learned to paint. And the aforementioned Engelgarts, the landlords with German-sounding names who were actually Russians, who owned the territory in which Taras was born. Well, Vasily, the father and lord of the lands, he died, leaving his son Pavlo in his stead as landlord and master to Shevchenko. And Pavlo, he wanted to have a young boy who could be a chamber artist, as that would give him quite a bit of status and credibility in the burgeoning romantic circles which the nobles and the dukes and the landlords traveled in those days. And so when he recognized that this young peasant orphan with no parents, Taras Shevchenko, could be quite useful for him, he took him into his household. He took him into his household. That's not to say that he was so nice to him. In fact, there's one famous story when he came home from a night out and he found young Taras scribbling and painting by candlelight. And he boxed him across the ears, whipped him, and had him lashed in the barn. "How dare you, Taras? How dare you? You threatened to burn down my estates." But Taras, he could not be dissuaded from pursuing a life of painting and pursuing a life of artistry. So finally, Pavlo Engelgart, he said, "You know what, Taras? Come with me. We're going to Vilno. Vilno. One of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world at the time, in Lithuania, in the Polish Commonwealth, which of course was partitioned and owned by Russia." And it was in Vilno in the early 1830s that Taras Shevchenko became inspired by revolutionary movements for the first time.
Yes, indeed. In Vilno. You may know it as Vilnius. 1830 was the year when the Polish uprising occurred. Master Pavlo left for St. Petersburg, and I was left behind to see the blood-soaked streets for myself.
And this is where Taras, he becomes exposed to the idea of revolution and fervor, because the Poles, they wanted to throw off the yoke of Tsar Nicholas I. Now, when Taras was born, he was born under the reign of Alexander I. But Alexander, he died suddenly from a bout of typhus. And his younger brother, Constantine, he had already relinquished his own claim to the throne, saying that he never wanted to be Tsar. And so the unlikely Nicholas Romanov, who would soon become Nicholas I in 1825, he took the reins of power. And Nicholas I, well, he is one of history's most notorious tyrants, a cruel suppressor of minority rights, an autocrat, a chauvinist, a believer in a hard, firm, iron-like grip of power. 2, the subjugation of people such as Ukrainians and such as the Poles. And so he cruelly suppressed the Novemberist uprising. He cruelly suppressed the Polish rebellion. And it was at that time that Taras Shevchenko came to St. Petersburg, my old stomping grounds. That's where I used to live, Lovashut. Oh, 1699, when the Ottomans were kicked out of Buda. So a 17-year-old Shevchenko comes into St. Petersburg in the 1830s. And he meets members of the intelligentsia, poets, both of Russian and Ukrainian stripes, academics, literature men, painters. Most notable of all, the painter, the famous Russian painter, Karl Brulyov. I definitely butchered that name. But Karl Brulyov, he recognizes, wow, this little Ukrainian lad, he is a talented boy. And so Taras's new friends, they devise a plan to set him free from serfdom. The statue of Vezir Abdurrahman Abdi Arnaut Pasha. Ezer Chatzas Niltzvan Hat. One of the best examples of a monument left behind to the Ottoman era. One of the only examples. The back bowl of Budapest on the Buda side. A spring awakening. And it was a spring awakening that must have emerged in Taras Shevchenko's heart when he finally won his freedom. And this is when his artistic fulminescence, his artistic magnificence began to truly blossom and take root. And his fame surged. And why did his fame surge? Well, in 1840, in addition to the wonderful progress he was making as a painter with oil paintings that won acclaim, such as Portrait of a Gypsy Fortune Teller and Katerina, in 1840, he published his first collection of poetry. And it wasn't Russian poetry, it was Ukrainian poetry. The collection was known as Kobzar. Now, Kobzar was a short collection. It was 8 poems in verse, with the foreword also in verse. And Kobzar was a collection that continued to grow and grow and become more and more brilliant as Shevchenko's life went on. But even when it was published, these 8 poems, they changed the history of Ukraine forever. You know, at the beginning of the 19th century, when Taras was born, this is when the first major literary works in the Ukrainian language were coming to life. And Kobzar, it was a crescendo on this movement of this national awakening, of this national emergence of the Ukrainian literature, which was known, this language of Ukrainian, it was known as Little Russian to the arrogant, snobby Russians. But Ukrainian was a language that needed a spark. It needed someone to carry the torch and say, we are here. We are on the European scene. And that is what Kobzar did. And Shevchenko, his fame bloomed just like these wonderful sakura blossoms on the cherry trees.
I never did it for the fame. I did it for my people. I did it for Ukraine.
So throughout the 1840s, Shevchenko continues to publish, he continues to paint. He becomes recognized as an official artist in St. Petersburg. And it's during the 1840s that he begins to make return voyages to his native Ukraine. And he's fairly horrified by what he sees. His family, his friends, his countrymen, they live in these terrible, impoverished, disreputable conditions. They live in essentially pseudo-slavery. And Shevchenko, On one of these visits back in 1845, he becomes embroiled within the clandestine workings of the Brotherhood of Saint Cyril and Methodius, the secret Ukrainian Slavic society that was looking to push for federation and independence for the nationalities under the cruel stewardship and the cruel imperial reign of Tsar Nicholas I. People dining out on the streets. There is the glorious Matyas Templom, the King Matyas Church, one of the pearls of all of Hungary and all of Europe for that matter. There we can see the mighty Danube, Parliament in the distance in the offing. And Tsar Nicholas, he was the arch conservative of Europe at the time. He hated the idea of national rebellion. And so he became particularly paranoid when an informant reported to him of the happenings and the doings of the Brotherhood of Saint Cyril and Methodius, which Shevchenko was a member of. And he was enraged when he read a poem by Shevchenko, published in 1847, on the eve of these spring liberating movements of 1848, entitled Dream. For in this poem, which was a satire, Shevchenko besmirched and made fun of the Tsar and his family. Tsar Nicholas, he was not without a sense of humor. And he wasn't even particularly too unhappy when he read the passages of Dream that directly made fun of himself. But he became apoplectic when he read what Shevchenko had to say about his wife. Shevchenko called her frumpy and made fun of her facial tics and heaped scorn on the entire imperial family. And this, for Tsar Nicholas, was a sin which could not be forgiven. So while many of the members of the Brotherhood of Saint Cyril and Methodius were given relatively light imprisonments, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, maybe 4, Shevchenko, he was sentenced for life. Shevchenko, he was forced to march from St. Petersburg out to the fortress of Orsk, a brutal, desolate place. But the worst part of all for Shevchenko, who was forced as a conscript into the Russian military, was that Tsar Nicholas forbade him to paint and forbade him to write. And for a man who was just reaching the zenith of his artistry and his fame as Shevchenko was, this was the worst punishment imaginable. And that is why, when, in 1848, under the imperial policy of Nicholas I, a naval fleet was sent out to explore the new imperial lands around the Aral Sea, Shevchenko jumped at the opportunity to join the voyage, for they needed a man that was skilled with the brush and with the pencil to paint and draw the surroundings of these new lands in Central Asia. And though this was certainly a sad time for Shevchenko, it was not a time without hope, as he was exposed to new environments and new lands and new peoples. And some of his most memorable works and most memorable drawings were created during this period, when he drew the landscapes that he came across and the local Kazakhs and Tajiks and Uzbeks with whom he crossed paths. And you can see in Shevchenko a theme throughout all his work, which is the theme of fighting for the oppressed, of fighting against the domineering forces of reactionary conservatism, which Tsar Nicholas was the champion of. And so he continued to write against the orders of the Tsar, and he continued to paint and he continued to draw, both within his official purview as a surveyor of the Uralian lands, but also on his own time, in secret, in the dark, But unfortunately, when he returned to Orsk, this clandestine work was discovered. And Tsar Nicholas was none too happy by Shevchenko's disobedience. Here we are, Lovashut, below the castle wall. The street which Alexa and I called home for about a year and a half during the days of the COVID pandemic and its onset. Always great to live behind the fortress during times of plague. Always great. But the 1850s were not such a good time to live within a fortress, because when Tsar Nicholas discovered that Shevchenko had been writing against his orders, he dropped the hammer down even harder. And he said, no, no, no. Times are about to get tougher for you, Taras. And he banished him further away to the far reaches of the Caspian Sea at the fortress of Novopetrovsk. And these were the worst years of Shevchenko's life, as he was strictly monitored and was not allowed to print or publish or write or draw or paint. Although even there, he continued to do so in secret. You see, Tsar Nicky, you can't shut down the springs of creativity within a true artistic genius. You can try, but you shall fail. And Shevchenko, although he was weakened and left far below the usual physical capacity of a man in his late 30s, he survived Tsar Nicholas, who passed away. Oh, Pisat Mari Karoy. Here it is, here it is, here it is. Lovashut Tizenyolts, the place I once called home. Too bad I don't remember the key code. What was it? 2, 3, 6, 4. What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? Cannot return home. And neither could Taras Shevchenko. For even though he was freed by Tsar Alexander II, who was a much more liberal man, and actually ended up liberating all the serfs around Russia in 1861, Alexander was not so kind as to allow Shevchenko to return back to St. Petersburg, nor Moscow, least of all his native Ukraine. And so from 1857 till around 1859, Shevchenko lived in Nizhny Novgorod. But at least he was permitted to write and to publish and to print once more and to grace the world with his delightful verse and his delightful paintings. And that he did. And that he did. Until in 1859, he was arrested for blasphemy. And this sapped much of his remaining strength. And though he was freed, he was never allowed, or never able for that matter, to return home to Ukraine as he dreamed. And he died at the age of 47 in 1861, just months before Alexander II went ahead and liberated the serfs. And although he was originally buried in St. Petersburg, his friends, of which he had many, organized for his grave to be exhumed and for him to be taken by train to Moscow, where he was then carried on back into Ukraine and buried on a hill which now bears his name, the Taras Hill, formerly known as the Monk's Hill. And today, the Taras Hill is a pilgrimage site for Ukrainians and lovers of liberty far and wide. Oh, Kosanam. And I cannot wait to one day travel there myself as a pilgrim in search of the memory of Taras Shevchenko, in search of the flame of liberty which he carried forward through all of his magnificent life, and which continues to light the path of Ukrainians today who search for hope in these times of darkness, which have come before and have been vanquished and will once again be conquered and will once again be conquered. When I die, then make my grave high on an ancient mound, in my own beloved Ukraine, in steppe land without bound, whence one may see wide-skirted wheatland, Dnipro's steep-cliffed shore. There once may hear the blustering river wildly roar, till from Ukraine to the blue sea it bears in fierce endeavor the blood of foemen. Then I'll leave wheatland and hills forever, leave all behind, soar up until before the throne of God I'll make my prayer, for till that hour I shall know naught of God. Make my grave there and arise, sundering your chains, bless your freedom with the blood of foemen's evil veins. Then in that great family, a family new and free, do not forget, with good intent, speak quietly of me.